The desert remembered nothing. That was the first thing Sergeant First Class Derek Holt told every new arrival at Forward Operating Base Ironclad. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had buried 3 friends in sand that looked exactly like this: pale, fine-grained, indifferent. The kind of sand that swallowed boot prints within minutes and erased the evidence of everything that happened here. The desert doesn't keep score, he'd say. It just burns. He said it again on the morning Corporal Elaine Marsh arrived. She came in on the last supply run of the week, a rattling MRAP that had shed one of its mud flaps somewhere north of the firebase perimeter. She was the only passenger. She stepped down from the rear door carrying a single kit bag and a hardshell rifle case, and she stood there for a moment in the white glare of 0830 hours, looking out at the base like she was trying to calculate something. She was small. That was the first thing anyone noticed. 5'4", maybe 120 pounds in full kit, dark hair tucked tight under her patrol cap, face already starting to catch the sun. She couldn't have been older than 26, maybe 27, though the transfer paperwork said 29 and nobody had thought to double-check. Holt watched her from the motor pool fence. "That's our replacement shooter?" said Corporal Jason Briggs, chewing on the cap of a water bottle he'd already emptied. Briggs was 24, 6'2", and had been the unit's number 2 marksman since he qualified out of Benning 18 months ago. He had the particular confidence of someone who had been told he was exceptional and had not yet encountered sufficient evidence to doubt it. "Apparently," Holt said, "she looks like she's here to intern." A few of the others laughed. Specialist Ray Kowalski, who was sitting on an ammo crate cleaning his sidearm, didn't look up. He had the good sense, or maybe just the indifference, to let whatever this was unfold without commentary. The woman Marsh walked toward the admin building. She didn't look at them. She didn't look around the base with the wide, uncertain eyes of someone new to the environment. She walked like she already knew where things were, which was strange, because this was supposedly her first deployment to this theater. Captain Lydia Forsyth met her at the door. Forsyth was the company commander, 36, and built from the kind of competence that didn't need to announce itself. She'd done 2 tours in the Eastern Sector and 1 in the Northern Highlands before taking this command 6 months ago. She shook Marsh's hand, said something brief, and then they both went inside. "Transfer from the 3rd Recon Battalion," said Staff Sergeant Owen Graves, who had apparently found the time to read the paperwork. He was leaning against the fence post next to Holt, picking at the Velcro on his sleeve. "Qualified expert, that's all it says." "Qualified expert," Briggs repeated. "My grandmother is a qualified expert. She does the crossword in pen." "Your grandmother would last approximately 37 minutes out here," Graves said without effect. Briggs didn't answer that. The sun climbed. The base hummed with the low-frequency activity of a unit preparing for something. Vehicle checks, radio tests, ammunition accounting. The particular organized anxiety of men and women who knew that within 72 hours they would be doing something that could kill them, and who managed that knowledge by keeping their hands busy. Elaine Marsh came out of the admin building 2 hours later. She had her kit squared away, her rifle case gone, presumably stored in the armory, and she carried a folded map under one arm. She walked to the range berm at the south end of the base. Nobody invited her. Nobody offered to show her where it was. She just went. Kowalski watched her go. He set down his sidearm and squinted into the sun. "She's been here 4 hours, he said. "She's already going to the range." "Good," said Holt. "Maybe she'll figure out she's in over her head before we're downrange." Kowalski said nothing. He picked up his sidearm again. That evening, at the mission brief, Captain Forsyth laid out the operation. 3rd Squad would conduct a strike on a logistics node operating out of a series of hardened structures 14 kilometers into the Badani Valley. Intelligence suggested the node was supplying material to 3 separate active cells in the region. Neutralize it, document what they found, extract by H+4. The operation was called Iron Curtain. Sniper coverage, Forsyth said, clicking to the next slide, will be split between 2 overwatch positions. Position Alpha goes to Sergeant Briggs. Position Bravo goes to Corporal Marsh. Briggs looked up. Then he looked across the room at Marsh, who was sitting in the back row with her arms folded and her eyes on the projection screen. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the terrain map. Her expression was unreadable. Later, in the barracks hallway, Briggs pulled Holt aside. "What's her record?" he asked. "I don't know," Holt said. "What do you mean you don't know?" "I mean the file is thin. Like someone cleaned it out." Holt paused. "Or someone classified the good parts." Briggs chewed on that for a moment. "She qualified expert. That's all? That's what I've got." Briggs looked down the hallway toward the room Marsh had been assigned. The door was closed. No light came from under it. "She's going to get someone killed," he said. Holt didn't answer that. He walked away instead, and Briggs was left standing in the corridor with the certainty of someone who had already decided the shape of a situation he did not yet fully understand. The next day was a rehearsal day. They ran the approach route in the early morning, before the heat locked in. Graves led the element through the dry creek bed that would serve as their main axis, calling out decision points, marking rally positions. It was the kind of work that looked routine but wasn't the body learning to move through difficult terrain so the mind could be somewhere more useful during the actual operation. Marsh moved well. Holt noticed that, though he didn't say anything. She moved like someone who had done this before, not the practiced efficiency of training something older than that. The kind of ease that came from having made mistakes in the dark and survived them. At the halfway point, they stopped to rest in the shade of a rocky outcropping. The temperature was already above 100, and the air tasted like copper and dust. Briggs was eating a ration bar and watching Marsh. She had found a flat rock and was sitting with her back against the outcropping, canteen in one hand, map in the other. She was making small pencil marks on the map at intervals. "What are you marking?" Briggs asked. She didn't look up. "Wind break points. We've got weather support. Real-time atmospheric." "I know." She turned the map a few degrees, made another mark. Briggs let it sit for a moment. "What's your range record?" Now she looked up. Her eyes were the color of weathered stone gray-green, flat, not unfriendly exactly, but not warm either. She looked at him the way someone looks at a door they're deciding whether or not to open. "Clean," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have for you right now." She went back to the map. Briggs looked at Kowalski. Kowalski was eating his own ration bar and watching a hawk circle something on the far ridge. He offered nothing. "You know Briggs holds the company range record," said Specialist Marcus Webb, who was young enough to think this kind of information was useful. "I'm sure he does," Marsh said. 1,800 meters. Confirmed. "That's impressive. He's the best shooter in the battalion." Marsh folded the map carefully along its existing creases. She looked at Webb with an expression that was not unkind. "Tell him to keep up the good work," she said, and stood up and walked back to where Graves was calling the element to reform. Webb looked at Briggs. Briggs had the expression of a man who had thrown a punch and missed and was trying to decide if anyone had seen. "I don't like her," Webb said. "Nobody asked," Kowalski said. That afternoon, Captain Forsyth called Marsh into the TOC for a one-on-one. Holt happened to be passing the door, which was open when he caught a fragment of the conversation. Forsyth was asking about previous assignments. Marsh was answering in short, factual sentences. At one point, Forsyth said something Holt didn't catch, and Marsh said, "That's not on any record I can hand you, ma'am." There was a pause. Then Forsyth said, "I looked at what I could find. There wasn't much." "No-mo. The 3rd Recon Battalion doesn't explain absences." "No-mo." Another pause. Longer this time. "I need to know if you're ready," Forsyth said. Marsh's answer was immediate. "No inflation, no performance." "Yes, ma'am." Holt kept walking. That night, in the hour before lights out, a story circulated through the barracks. The story was about Desert Serpent, a name that had come up in intelligence briefings twice in the last 8 months, always in the same context. A long-range engagement of nearly impossible geometry that had eliminated a high-value target before any conventional element could close the distance. The first incident had occurred at approximately 2,200 meters. The second at an estimated distance that the intelligence analysts had initially rejected as a data error. Nobody knew who Desert Serpent was. The name appeared in 2 fragmentary signals intercepts, spoken with something adjacent to fear by men who were not accustomed to fear. Webb was the one who said it out loud, half joking, sitting on his bunk in the yellow light. "You think Marsh has anything to do with that?" Silence. Then Briggs said, "Don't be stupid." Kowalski said nothing. He lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about the way she'd marked the wind breakpoints on the map. Iron curtain launched at 0200 hours. The element moved in 2 columns through the creek bed, 10 meters between personnel, noise discipline hard. The desert at night was a different thing than the desert in the day. The heat bled out of the rocks slowly, leaving a chill that felt wrong after what the afternoon had been. The stars were brutal and numerous. There was no moon. Marsh moved to position Bravo before the main elements split for the assault. She went with a single spotter, Kowalski, who had volunteered with no explanation, and they disappeared into the rocky high ground to the east of the target structures without another word. Briggs took his position on the western ridge, above a gentle saddle that would give him direct sight lines into the compound. "Iron elements, radio check," Forsyth said over the net. Each position responded in sequence. Everyone was in place by 0310. At 0315, intelligence reported movement at the compound. Multiple personnel. The logistics node was apparently active. At 0317, the first shot came. It didn't come from Briggs. It came from the east from where Marsh was positioned, and it came without warning or request from Forsyth. 1 round, suppressed, and the compound's external sentry dropped without a sound. The remaining sentries hadn't processed what had happened before the main element was already breaching the first structure. "Contact, external," Forsyth said over the net. "Nice work, Bravo." No response from Bravo position. Holt, moving with the main element, felt something shift in the air. Not fear exactly, more like recalibration. The next 18 minutes were controlled chaos. The assault element cleared 3 structures, secured the material documentation Forsyth wanted, and was preparing for extract when the situation changed. The change came from the north. A second force not identified in pre-mission intelligence emerged from a shallow wadi 200 meters north of the compound. They were moving fast and they had numbers. The element counted at least 12 personnel before the count became academic because they had already taken fire. Holt went to ground behind a stone wall. Graves was to his left, Webb was to his right. pressing himself flat and breathing through his teeth. Contact north. Graves was calling it in. Multiple, 12, plus, moving south-southeast. A burst of fire cut over the wall and everyone stopped talking. Briggs, from his western position. I have partial sight on contact north, but the angle is bad. I cannot. Another burst. Closer. Forsyth. Bravo. What's your situation? Marsh's voice on the net. For the first time since departure, Bravo has eyes on. Stand by. One shot. Then another. 2 contacts dropped. 2 seconds between them. The rate of fire from the north slowed. Didn't stop but slowed, as if the attackers were suddenly uncertain where the danger was coming from. Bravo is working. Kowalski's voice. Give the element space. How far is Bravo from the contact? Holt asked. Not into the radio, just to himself, trying to run the geometry. Graves heard him anyway. Graves had been doing the same calculation. He looked at Holt across the 3 feet of open space between them and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Far. She was very, very far. The third shot dropped the element leader of the northern contact group. Holt identified him by the way the others reacted, pulling back, losing cohesion. 1 shot, and the whole attack faltered. Element is disengaging, Forsyth said. Iron, prepare to extract. Bravo, cover our route. Understood, Marsh said. 2 more shots on the way out. 2 more contacts that had briefly repositioned and briefly regretted it. The element extracted at 0412, 14 minutes ahead of schedule. Post-mission debrief happened at 0600, while the base was still shaking the night out of itself. Forsyth ran through the sequence. She was careful and methodical, as she always was. She had the shots mapped out on a whiteboard: time, direction, approximate distance. The intelligence section had already started reconstructing the geometry from the GPS data and radio timestamps. When she got to the 5th and 6th shots, the ones that had covered the extraction route, she paused. We're still refining, she said, but preliminary assessment puts the 5th engagement at approximately 2100 meters, the 6th at approximately 2300. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are not usually quiet. Briggs was sitting in the 2nd row. He was looking at the whiteboard with an expression that had started as disbelief and was working its way towards something more complicated. That's not right, he said. The geometry doesn't support 2300 from Bravo position. We're still refining, Forsyth said again. The wind was variable out of the north-northeast. The target was moving. At 2300 meters, accounting for spin drift alone, he stopped. He ran the numbers in his head, and his expression shifted again. That's not possible. Marsh was sitting in the back corner of the room. She had been still and quiet since she'd walked in, which was her standard. She was looking at the whiteboard, not at Briggs. What round? Briggs asked. Standard issue for her loadout, Graves said. Standard issue. Briggs sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at Marsh. You want to explain this? Marsh looked at him. No, she said. No? No. Her voice had no challenge in it, no performance. Just the flat statement of someone who had decided that explanation was not required. Briggs opened his mouth. Thank you, Corporal, Forsyth said, which was aimed at Marsh but closed the room's appetite for the question. Get some rest, everyone. We'll have Iron Curtain final analysis by 1400. The room cleared. Holt stayed. Kowalski stayed. Forsyth was erasing the whiteboard distances and rewriting them with question marks next to the long ones. How long have you known her? Holt asked Kowalski. Kowalski shrugged. Never met her before she stepped off that MRAP, but you volunteered to spot for her. Kowalski looked at him. You ever watch someone move through terrain and just know, like before they've done anything specific, you just know that person has been here before, not this place, but this situation? Holt waited. That's what it was, Kowalski said. He picked up his cap from the table. She didn't need me spotting for her. She was spotting for herself. He paused at the door. I just didn't want her to be alone out there. He left. Holt stood there in the empty debrief room with the whiteboard and its question marks and the weight of 2300 meters pressing on something in his chest. There had been a mission called Copper Ridge. This was 18 months ago, in a different theater, under different command. The official record was thin 4 lines in a declassified summary. The unofficial version lived in the memory of the people who had been there and in the signals, intelligence archives that nobody looked at anymore. Copper Ridge was supposed to neutralize a network commander. The operation required a precision engagement at extreme range, under night conditions, in difficult terrain. The sniper assigned to the operation was called in at the last minute as a replacement for the originally scheduled shooter, who had been pulled due to a family emergency. The shot was taken. The target was eliminated. Then something went wrong with the extraction. The supporting element made contact at a location they hadn't anticipated, and the sniper working alone, because the spotter had been disabled in the initial contact, was cut off from the primary route. The sniper had not returned through the primary route. The official record recorded the sniper as missing. Status unknown. The unofficial version, the one that moved through the community in fragments and half sentences over the following months, said that the supporting element's contact point had been compromised from the inside, that someone had given the position, that the isolation of the sniper had been deliberate. Nobody said this officially. Nobody could prove it. But the name Desert Serpent had appeared in enemy signals 5 weeks later, spoken not in triumph, not as a threat eliminated, but with something that sounded, in translation, like a warning, like a name you did not want to hear again. The sniper had not been missing. The sniper had simply left. Elaine Marsh had not slept in 36 hours. She was sitting on the floor of the armory with her back against the wall, field stripping her rifle in the dark by feel. Not because she needed to, because her hands needed to be doing something while her mind ran the route she would have to run tomorrow. There was a second operation already being planned. Iron Curtain had confirmed the logistics node, and the intelligence from the documents they'd secured pointed to a higher value target in the same area of operations. Forsyth had briefed it that afternoon. She had asked Marsh to stay afterward. "I need you to understand something," Forsyth had said. Marsh had waited. "I don't care what's in your file, or what isn't in it. What I care about is the 8 people in this element who are going home." Forsyth had looked at her directly, no softening around it. "I need to know if there's something I should know." Marsh had held the question for a long moment. Then she said, "The reason I came back to active duty wasn't random. Tell me, the man we're going to be looking at in the follow-on operation. He was the intelligence coordinator for Copper Ridge." Forsyth had been still for a moment. "You know this how?" "Because I spent 14 months finding out." Another silence. Then Forsyth had said, "Does this compromise your judgment?" And Marsh had said, without hesitation, "No, it sharpens it." Forsyth had studied her for a long time. Then she nodded once and said, "Dismissed." In the armory, in the dark, Marsh reassembled her rifle without looking. Her hands knew the sequence the way lungs know to breathe. She pressed the lower receiver into place and felt a click. Outside, the desert was absolute. No wind, no sound. Even the insects, when they existed out here at all, had gone quiet. She thought about Copper Ridge. She thought about the compromised position and the 8-hour run through terrain that would have killed most people. She thought about the moment she had understood, with clinical certainty, that she had been left there deliberately. She had not been afraid. That was the thing she remembered most. She had expected to feel afraid, and instead she had felt something colder and more useful. A clarity. The desert burning down to a single, simple proposition. Survive, then finish it. She had survived. Now she was here. The follow-on Operation Copper Dawn launched 48 hours after Iron Curtain. This time, the target was a person, not a place. Call sign, Architect. Real name in the intelligence files, cross-referenced with Copper Ridge in a way that Forsyth had found when she'd gone looking, quietly, through the archives. The intelligence coordinator. The man who had known where everyone would be and had arranged for certain people to know it. Marsh was in position Bravo again. Same eastern high ground, different angle this time. The target structure was 300 meters further north, which changed the geometry considerably. Kowalski was with her again. He had asked. She had not objected. They reached the position at 0, 2, 4, 5 and went still. The desert around them was its usual indifferent dark. The rocks held the day's heat and gave it back slowly. Kowalski set up his observation glass while Marsh confirmed her range cards and made the adjustments she'd been calculating since the previous afternoon. "Winds shifting," Kowalski said quietly. "I know." She had been watching the microdisturbances in the sand below them for the last hour. The wind out here did not behave the way it behaved at the range. It moved in layers, different velocities at different heights, and a bullet traveling 2,200 meters would pass through all of them. She had spent 4 hours the previous afternoon refining her dope. She had run the ballistic calculations 6 times. She had stood at the edge of the base and watched the way the heat shimmer moved across the valley floor and incorporated that into her picture. "You always this thorough?" Kowalski asked. Not challenging, genuinely curious. "The ones that didn't make it weren't," she said. He nodded slowly. "How many times have you been at this range?" She looked through her scope. The target structure was a pale smudge in the green thermal world of her optic. "Past 2,200? Yeah." She adjusted her elevation turret by half a click. Four hits? 4 hits. He absorbed that. Then, "You're a long way from qualified expert." She didn't respond to that. She was watching the structure. A light had gone on inside. "Eyes on movement," she said. Kowalski pressed his eye to the glass. Confirmed. 2 personnel, interior, below, at the compound. The main element was in position. Forsyth's voice came on the net, low and controlled. "Copper elements, standby." The light inside the structure moved. Someone was walking toward the window. "Possible target profile," Kowalski said. Marsh settled. This was the thing that people did not understand and could not be taught: the settling. The body's agreement with the moment. The breath finding its own level. The heartbeat spacing itself out. She had been told, early in her training, that the ideal moment to fire was between heartbeats, and she had understood even then that this was insufficient. The ideal moment was when the heartbeat itself slowed enough to stop being a variable. She had learned to slow her heartbeat. She did not know how. She had simply needed to, once, in a situation where the alternative was not coming home, and her body had found a way. The figure at the window became clearer. Male. Height consistent with intelligence. Posture consistent, and then he turned slightly, and the thermal profile of his face became distinct enough for Kowalski to say, "Positive ID. Architect confirmed." Marsh's finger was already on the trigger. She did not pull it. She pressed it, the way you have to, slow and steady, no anticipation, no flinch, no announcement. The body moving in one smooth and practiced direction. The rifle fired. Downrange, 2,140 meters away. Architect did not take another step. The extraction went clean. Nobody shot at them. Nobody appeared. The secondary element, which had been positioned to cover a possible reaction force, stood down without engaging. The valley absorbed the operation the way it absorbed everything impassively, without record, turning back into empty desert almost before they had left it. On the MRAP back to Ironclad, nobody spoke much. Webb was looking out the viewport with the expression of someone who had just passed an exam he hadn't expected to pass. Graves was running through the sequence in his head, the way he always did, counting what had gone right and cataloging what could go wrong next time. Holt was watching Marsh. She was sitting across from him, rifle between her knees, head against the vehicle wall. Her eyes were open. She was looking at nothing specific. She looked, he thought, like someone at the end of a very long walk. Not exhausted exactly, just arrived. At the base, Forsyth gathered the element in the debrief room before anyone had a chance to disperse. She ran through the sequence again, same methodical efficiency, same whiteboard. The architect engagement was listed with its confirmed distance and the single word, neutralized. When she was done, she looked at the room. "I want to say something on the record," she said. Her voice had changed register slightly, still controlled, but with something underneath it that wasn't usually there. This element performed exceptionally across 2 operations in 48 hours. Every person in this room contributed to 2 successful outcomes. She paused. "I also want to acknowledge that our most critical engagements in both operations were executed by Corporal Marsh at ranges that fall outside any standard I've seen in this command." The room was very quiet. Briggs was in the front row this time. He had stopped looking complicated about it. He was just looking at his hands. "I don't have a lot to add to that," Forsyth said. "I think actions speak adequately for themselves." She nodded and the room began to move, people standing, reaching for gear. Marsh was already heading for the door. Briggs stood up. He turned. "Marsh." She stopped. She looked back. He had clearly rehearsed something. Whatever it was, he seemed to decide against it. What he said instead was, "The wind break points. On your map, during the rehearsal, how far in advance were you calculating?" She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not warmth, not exactly, but a relaxation of the distance. "From the moment I read the terrain analysis," she said. 2 days before we moved." He nodded slowly. "That's good craft." "Yes," she said. "It is." She went out. Briggs stood there for a moment. Then he sat back down in his chair and didn't move for a while. Holt, passing behind him, put a hand on his shoulder briefly and said nothing. The next morning was still. Marsh was at the range at 0600. Not because she needed practice. She needed the quiet, and the range was the only place on the base where the activity paused long enough to feel like silence. She was working at 500 meters close range for her, almost meditative when Forsyth appeared at the lane next to her. The captain watched for a moment. Then she picked up a rifle from the rack, her own, which she kept at the range, and loaded a magazine. They shot in parallel for a while without speaking. Forsyth was good, not in Marsh's register, but genuinely, technically proficient, the kind of shooter who would hit what she aimed at under conditions that would defeat most people. After 15 minutes, Forsyth lowered her rifle and said, "Copper Ridge." Marsh lowered hers. "You know the full picture?" Marsh asked. "Enough of it, then you know why I needed to find him." "I know." Forsyth looked downrange. "I also know that what you did last night wasn't just mission execution for you." Marsh didn't confirm or deny that. She reloaded. "I'm going to need your full record," Forsyth said. "Whatever got classified, whatever got scrubbed, I'm going to need it for the debrief I'll eventually have to write." "I know. And I'm going to need you to stay." Marsh's hands paused on the magazine. She looked at the captain. "We have 3 more weeks in this operational cycle," Forsyth said. "After what I saw in the last 2 operations, I'm not going to stand here and pretend I don't want you on this team." She paused. "But that's not the only reason I'm asking." Marsh waited. "You spent 14 months out there alone," Forsyth said. "Finding something. Working towards something. And now you found it." She turned to look at Marsh directly. "The thing I've seen happen to people in that situation, they don't always know what to do with themselves when the target's gone." The range was very quiet. A distant generator hummed. The sun was already building toward its daily excess. "I've thought about that," Marsh said. "And?" She seated the magazine, "And I think it's a fair concern." She raised the rifle. "But I'm not done here." Forsyth watched her. Then she nodded, once, and raised her own rifle. They shot in parallel again. the report of each shot absorbed by the desert and then released into the enormous sky. Holt found Kowalski at the motor pool, working on a vehicle's suspension system with the kind of focused application that meant he was thinking about something else entirely. "You knew," Holt said. Kowalski looked up. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Knew? What specifically?" "Who she was. You volunteered to spot for her because you already knew." Kowalski looked at him for a moment. Then he climbed out from under the vehicle and sat on the running board. "I did 2 months at the 3rd Recon Battalion 3 years ago," he said. "Cross-attachment, before my current assignment." He turned the rag over in his hands. There was a story there, in the building, about a shooter who had gone beyond the normal metrics, not just by a bit, but by a margin that made people uncomfortable, because it raised the question of what you were actually measuring. Holt waited. "Range records," Kowalski said. "Qualification scores. They measure what you can do in controlled conditions. They don't measure what you can do when it's dark and you're alone and someone is coming for you and you have one chance." He looked up. "There's a different category for that. There's no official record for it." "Desert Serpent," Holt said. The name came from a recovered intercept. Enemy communications. The analysts who translated it said the word they used wasn't exactly serpent. It was closer to something that strikes from where it cannot be seen. They called it Desert Serpent for the report because it was shorter. Holt thought about this. She never confirmed it. "No." In the debrief, Forsyth asked direct. "I was there." She just nodded. "Yeah." Kowalski folded the rag. "That's her version of a speech." Holt laughed, unexpectedly. It came out short and genuine and a little surprised, and Kowalski allowed himself a small smile in response. "What happens now?" Holt asked. "What do you mean?" "Architect is neutralized. The thing she came back for, it's done." Kowalski looked at the vehicle. "I asked her something like that, the second night in position. Just the 2 of us up there, waiting." He paused. "She said the mission didn't change when the personal reason ended. The mission was always the mission." "That sounds like something you say." "Maybe. But she meant it differently than how it sounds." Kowalski stood up. "She said it like someone who had been looking for a place to stand for a long time and had finally found a spot that felt like ground." Holt considered that. He looked toward the range, which was quiet now the morning session had ended. The desert beyond the berm was its usual blazing nothing. "She stays?" he asked. "She stays." He nodded. Then he headed back toward the operations center, where the next cycle of planning was already beginning. 3 weeks later, the elements stood down. The operational cycle ended with a ceremony that Forsyth kept brief. She knew her people, and she knew that what they needed after the last month was not speeches. She read the commendations, she made the handshakes. She released everyone to a 24-hour stand-down with the dry economy of a commander who respected time. The commendations included Corporal Elaine Marsh, listed for 2 confirmed long-range engagements critical to the success of Operations Iron Curtain and Copper Dawn, and for demonstrated proficiency under extreme operational conditions. The official commendation did not include the distances. They remained in the classified appendix, where they would likely stay for years, read occasionally by people with the clearance to access them and the experience to understand what they meant. Briggs found Marsh at the south fence that evening, as the sun went down and the desert turned the color of hammered copper. He had been carrying something around for several days and had finally decided to put it down. "I owe you something," he said. She looked at him. "You don't. I made assumptions about you. Everyone did. I was louder about it." She turned back to the horizon. The sun was halfway down, still enormous, doing what it always did, burning without apology, without acknowledgement of audience. "I've been in environments where I was the person doing that," she said, assuming, making the judgment before I had information. A pause. "I was wrong those times too." Briggs absorbed that. "Does it bother you? The way we treated you when you first came in?" She thought about it genuinely. Not the question she would have been asked a year ago, or the answer she would have given then. This version, here, now, with the copper light on the desert and 3 weeks of honest work behind her. "It bothered me less than it should have," she said. "That's probably not healthy." He laughed, short and surprised. She almost smiled. "The windbreak points," he said. "Can you show me how you do that?" She looked at him. The wariness in her eyes, the long-trained professional distance shifted slightly. "Not gone. Adjusted. Tomorrow morning," she said. 0600. "Bring the terrain analysis for the next operational area." "We don't have the next operational area yet." "Then bring a map of somewhere difficult." She looked back at the horizon. "The method is the same." He nodded. He started to go. "Briggs." He stopped. 1,800 meters in variable crosswind," she said. "That's not nothing. Don't let anyone tell you it is." He held that for a moment. Then he nodded again and walked back toward the barracks. Marsh stayed at the fence until the sun finished its descent. The sky went through its sequence: copper, amber, deep red, and then the rapid purple collapse into desert dark. The stars appeared with their usual sudden completeness. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes, which was always a shock, and never got less so. Kowalski appeared beside her at some point. She hadn't heard him come. He was holding 2 canteens and offered one without comment. She took it. "Forsyth got the preliminary approval," he said. "You're officially assigned to this element, no more transfer paperwork." She drank cold water, which meant someone had remembered to pre-chill them and she hadn't. "The file?" she asked. "Still classified. But Forsyth is writing something for the record, something accurate." He looked at the stars. "She said it should be there. What actually happened?" Marsh nodded slowly. "Copper Ridge," he said. "Not a question, just the name. Out there in the air. They left me out there," she said. "It was deliberate." And then, she stopped. Started differently. 14 months, 3 countries, 13 contacts, 1 network, 1 name at the end of it. She paused. "I didn't sleep well for 14 months. And now?" She considered. The desert was doing what it always did at night, breathing out, slowly releasing what it had absorbed. The rocks giving back their stored warmth, the sand cooling 1 millimeter at a time. "Better," she said. It was a small word for a large thing. But she had never been in the habit of using large words for the things that mattered most to her. That was the kind of inflation that didn't serve anyone. They stood there a while longer, 2 people in the dark at the edge of a military base at the edge of a desert, looking at a sky that had no opinion about any of it. Then Kowalski said, "Graves is making something questionable in the mess hall, and Webb is claiming it's edible." "What is it?" "Unknown. That's why it's questionable." She pushed off the fence. She handed back the canteen. She walked toward the barracks where the lights were on and the voices carried in the cooling air. Behind her, the desert stretched to all horizons, flat and indifferent and enormous. It had burned through another day without keeping score, without marking anything. All the things that had happened here, the shots, the silences, the long patient hours of waiting already dissolving into the sand. But she remembered. She always would. That was not a burden. It was just what she was. The desert doesn't keep score. She does.